Hello, my name is Jason Sartori, and I am the Chief of the Countywide Planning and Policy Division at the Montgomery County Planning Department. Thank you for tuning in to this presentation on the 2020 to 2024 Growth and Infrastructure Policy, which is the new name for what was previously called the Subdivision Staging Policy. I hope that you find this presentation helpful in understanding the new policy. Toward the end of the video, I'll share links to additional helpful resources as well as contact information for planning staff should you have any additional questions. The Growth and Infrastructure Policy implements Montgomery County's Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance, or APFO. The policy defines infrastructure adequacy and how we measure it, particularly with respect to school and transportation facilities. When the APFO was first created in 1973, the county was experiencing greenfield development in areas completely devoid of infrastructure. Today, the county's growth paradigm is focused on infill and redevelopment, and this type of development places very different demands on our infrastructure. To better understand this, we set out to craft a policy that was data-driven and stakeholder-informed. Early conversations with stakeholders were heavily focused on the data. We asked people to help us analyze the data, to suggest alternative approaches to operationalizing the concepts we were trying to measure and trying to understand, and to engage in discussions with us and each other about the implications of the data on the policy. With regard to schools, we set out to better understand how different neighborhood characteristics and how different types of housing have different impacts on school enrollment. We wanted to build a policy that would be sensitive to these differences as well as the new growth paradigm I described earlier. Another important focus of our effort was to support the county's other policy priorities, including meeting our housing, economic development, equity, and Vision Zero safety goals. To start, I will give a quick summary of the major changes to the 2020 to 2024 Growth and Infrastructure Policy, which was unanimously adopted by the County Council on November 16, 2020. The policy takes effect on January 1st, 2021. With regard to schools, the most transformational change was to classify neighborhoods into school impact areas based on the area's recent and anticipated housing and enrollment growth. These school impact areas were then used to reset and right-size school impact taxes charged to developers. The new taxes are calculated at 100% of a unit's cost to the school system based on how many students are typically generated within the school impact area. While this represented a major shift in the context sensitivity of the policy, the marquee change to the policy was the elimination of residential development moratoria countywide. Under the new policy, school service areas will no longer be placed in moratorium because of school overcrowding. Instead, the new growth and infrastructure policy establishes tiered utilization premium payments, where the amount paid by a developer increases with higher levels of school utilization. The aim of these changes is to eliminate the uncertainty and inefficiency associated with residential development moratoria and to further support the county's housing goals, while still addressing the fiscal requirements for increasing school capacity and improving school facility conditions. The new policy also required the adoption of annual school test guidelines, outlining the methodologies used to conduct the annual school test and to estimate the enrollment impacts of residential development applications. This adds transparency to the adequate public facilities process. The Planning Board adopted version 1.0 of the guidelines on December 17, 2020. Another significant change, which is detailed in the newly adopted guidelines, is the shortening of the annual school test timeframe from looking at projected utilization 5 years in the future to looking only 4 years in the future. This change allows the school test to be conducted using enrollment projections that are historically more accurate, but also ensures that the test only incorporates school capacity projects that are included in the county's adopted capital improvements program. The last major change related to schools is an update to the data used to calculate multifamily student generation rates, which are then used to estimate the enrollment impacts of development applications and to set the impact tax rates. The new student generation rates are only based on average student generation for multifamily structures built since 1990. New development has been found to be consistent with structures built in the last 3 decades and markedly different in terms of student generation from those built prior to 1990. For single-family units, we continue to use the entire single-family housing stock to calculate student generation rates. For these units, the age of the structure has less of a correlation to student generation than how recently the home has sold. There were also some significant changes made with regard to the transportation element of the policy. In general, the new policy prioritizes strategies and efforts designed to improve travel safety. The new policy requires applicants to prepare a Vision Zero statement for all projects estimated to generate 50 or more peak hour person trips. The statement must describe crash conditions around the site distances at development access points, potential conflicts between vehicles and bicyclists and pedestrians, and other safety related concerns. Most significantly, the new policy eliminates the motor vehicle adequacy test for development applications in red policy areas. These are the areas generally within a half mile of a metro station or a future Purple Line station. The pedestrian, bicycle, and bus transit adequacy tests are still required in these areas where multimodal transportation is prevalent and most relevant from a safety perspective. And actually, the policy made some important updates to the requirements for these multimodal tests across the entire county. The geographic scope of these new tests is scaled based on the size of the development project, and the mitigation improvements are more focused on providing safe bikeways, sidewalks, and bus shelters. Finally, the new policy exempts bioscience facilities for the next 4 years from all transportation adequacy tests in order to provide faster approval of facilities that support biological research and development or the manufacturing of related products. This thriving industry is key to the economic vitality of the county as it provides significant employment opportunities. Now, technically, impact taxes are not part of the growth and infrastructure policy. However, they are very directly related and are intended to work in coordination with the policy. As a result, several major changes were made to the county's impact tax law concurrent with the adoption of the growth and infrastructure policy. I already mentioned that the school impact taxes have been reset and right-sized based on the student generation within the different school impact areas. The rates for transportation impact taxes have not been changed. However, the County Council added a new transportation impact tax discount for projects in orange and yellow policy areas located within the county's desired growth and investment areas. These desired growth areas include most of the COG activity centers in the county and 3 bus rapid transit corridors, US 29, Maryland 355, and Veers Mill. A new use was added to the transportation impact tax schedule for agricultural facilities. To encourage agritourism in the county, the rate for this use was set at $0 per square foot. The council also made changes to the impact tax exemptions. The exemption for former enterprise zones was eliminated, but a new exemption was added for development in qualified opportunity zones certified by the U.S. Treasury Department. This exemption applies to both school and transportation impact taxes. Additional modifications were made to the impact tax exemption for market rate homes and projects with 25% affordable units. These changes require the affordable units to be placed in the county's or a municipality's MPDU program, and in some parts of the county, it limits the amount of the exemption. On the school side, a new 40% impact tax discount was added to encourage 3-bedroom units in multifamily structures within infill impact areas. I'll now take some time to discuss some of the growth and infrastructure policy changes in more detail. This map shows the designation of school impact areas across the county, which provides a more context-sensitive measure for the calculation of school impact taxes and development review. Areas shown in blue are infill impact areas, which are defined by high levels of development, mostly in the form of multifamily, which generates very few students on a per-unit basis. The rest of the county, in tan, is identified as turnover impact areas. These areas have generally seen or are expected to see low housing growth, and any enrollment growth these areas are experiencing is primarily due to ownership turnover in existing single-family neighborhoods. While some neighborhoods in the turnover impact areas, like those around Clarksburg, have seen their fair share of student-generating single-family development in recent years, the designation of school impact areas placed an emphasis on forward-looking data. This included the results of the Planning Department's residential capacity analysis, which looked parcel by parcel across the county at zone capacity, existing land uses, and other market factors to determine the potential for future development. Ultimately, even Clarksburg was designated a turnover impact area. Here you can see the old school impact tax rates. There was one set of rates used countywide, and those rates were calculated at 120% of the cost of a student seat generated by new development. These are the new school impact taxes, which were recalculated based on 100% of the cost instead of 120%. As you can see, we now have impact taxes calculated for each of the two school impact areas. This bottom table shows the change in the rates. In every single case, in all parts of the county, and for all types of dwelling units, the impact taxes have come down. This was intentional in an attempt, once again, to right-size the school impact taxes and make residential development in Montgomery County more competitive within the region. As mentioned earlier, the new growth and infrastructure policy eliminated residential development moratoria. Instead, the new policy requires an applicant to make utilization premium payments on top of any applicable impact taxes for building in an area served by a school that is projected to be overcrowded. This table shows the utilization rate and seat deficit thresholds that apply to the three tiers of utilization premium payments. Each individual school is evaluated against the thresholds using the enrollment and capacity projections for 4 years in the future. Because each school, the elementary school, middle school, and high school, serving the development site is evaluated separately, each school could trigger a different payment tier or no utilization premium payment at all. This next set of columns demonstrates the payment that is required. The more overcrowded the school, the higher the payment requirement. These payment percentages are shares of the applicable non-discounted and non-exempt school impact tax. For shorthand, the tiers are often recognized by their total payment percentage, 40% for Tier 1, 80% for Tier 2, and 120% for Tier 3. However, these total percentages only apply if all three schools trigger the same tier of payments. For example, if all three schools are at Tier 3, the 50% elementary school payment plus the 30% middle school payment plus the 40% high school payment totals a payment of 120% on top of the impact taxes. This table translates the percentages on the previous slide into actual dollar amounts for the remainder of fiscal year 2021. The county's impact tax code requires the impact tax rates for both schools and transportation to be updated every 2 years on July 1st of odd numbered years. This means that the impact tax rates will be updated again on July 1st, 2021 for fiscal years FY22 and FY23. Because the utilization premium payments are calculated as a percentage of the applicable school impact tax, the dollar amount shown on this slide will also be updated for FY22 and 23. Now, the utilization premium payment status for each school is determined on an annual basis through the annual school test. The new growth and infrastructure policy required the planning board to adopt a set of annual school test guidelines to identify the methods used to conduct the test and to evaluate development applications against the test results. Version 1.0 of the guidelines was adopted by the planning board on December 17, 2020, and the guidelines have been posted to the planning department website at the URL provided on this slide. The annual school test is conducted each spring and takes effect on July 1st, and the results of the test remain in effect for the entirety of the fiscal year. The results of an updated FY21 school test were certified by the Planning Board on December 17, 2020, to take effect on January 1st, 2021. These reflect the rules of the new growth and infrastructure policy. This slide shows the summary of those school test results. It identifies which schools qualify for a Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3 utilization premium payment. This slide shows the detail provided in the annual school test results for each individual school. Here, you can see the utilization premium payment status for each school. For example, in FY21, Ashburton Elementary School requires a Tier 1 utilization premium payment. These last three columns indicate the adequacy ceilings for each school and each utilization premium payment tier. These are the number of additional projected students that would cause the school to trigger the applicable utilization premium payment tier. Continuing with the Ashburn Elementary School example, you can see that it is only 3 students away from triggering a Tier 2 status and 122 students away from triggering a Tier 3 status. This is important because if a development application in the Ashburn Elementary School service area will generate more than 3 students, the applicant will be required to make a partial Tier 1 payment and a partial Tier 2 payment. The payments that are made are proportional to the number of students the application generates over the adequacy ceiling. The link at the bottom of this slide is to the page where the detailed school test results are posted on the Planning Department's website. Here's an example of a hypothetical development application for 50 single-family detached homes in the Ashburn Elementary School, North Bethesda Middle School, and Walter Johnson High School service areas. Assuming this project is located within an infill impact area, these 50 units will be estimated to generate 10 elementary school students, 4 middle school students, and 6 high school students. Now remember, the FY21 school test indicates that Ashburn Elementary School requires a Tier 1 utilization premium payment. It also indicates that it's only 3 students away from triggering a Tier 2 payment. Since this hypothetical application generates more than those 3 elementary school students, 10 to be exact, the payment requirements must be proportionally allocated across the 2 tiers. Therefore, 3 students are allocated to Tier 1, and the remaining 7 students are allocated to Tier 2. Now, if this application were to be approved, it would include the following condition, indicating the applicant must pay 0.3 of a Tier 1 elementary school utilization premium payment and 0.7 of a Tier 2 elementary school utilization premium payment for each unit. The important thing to note is that this would not impact the school status for future applications that come before the planning board during the same fiscal year for the same service area. In other words, every application that comes forward in the Ashburn Elementary School service area will receive the same treatment under the same annual school test. The first 3 elementary school students generated by each application will require a Tier 1 payment, and all students generated beyond the third will require a Tier 2 payment. For the transportation element, we've been taking a context-sensitive approach for quite some time. With the 2016 update to the subdivision staging policy, the Council created 4 policy area categories based on current land use patterns, the prevalence of different modes of travel, and the planning vision for the policy area. The 4 policy areas categories are identified as red, orange, yellow, and green, and are defined as explained on this slide. The categories are used to determine applicable transportation impact taxes and how the multimodal adequacy tests are applied. With the new growth and infrastructure policy, the Council made some modifications to the policy area boundaries and to some of the categorizations. This included creating new red policy areas around the Forest Glen, Medical Center, and Tacoma Metro stations. Policy areas were defined based on the walksheds around the future Purple Line stations as well, and these were also designated as red policy areas. A few other policy area boundaries were modified. The Chevy Chase Lake policy area shrunk a little bit to be more consistent with a half-mile walkshed. The Grosvenor policy area expanded to include parcels with an institutional use that is generally within the walkshed. The North Bethesda policy area was expanded west of the I-270 spur to ensure that the entire Rock Spring master plan area would have the same designation and same treatment under the policy. And finally, a small modification was made to the Rockville Town Center policy area to include a couple of parcels that the City of Rockville anticipates annexing in the near future. This map zooms into the down county policy areas to show the Purple Line station areas in particular. Number 5 is the Chevy Chase Lake policy area. Number 40 is the new Littonsville policy area. 41 is the new Woodside policy area. And 43 is a new area called Purple Line East, which includes several Purple Line stations that have connecting walksheds. A detailed web map which identifies these new policy areas and all others can be found at the URL provided on this slide. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the Local Area Transportation Review, or LATR, transportation adequacy tests. The motor vehicle adequacy test, which appears in section TL 2.2 of the policy resolution, has not changed from a scoping or procedural perspective. The big change for this, as mentioned earlier, is that the motor vehicle test is no longer required for development in the red policy areas. The new test also clarifies that the applicant is only required to mitigate its impact on vehicle delay or down to the applicable policy area standard, whichever is less. Additional language was added to clearly delineate mitigation strategy priorities, helping to avoid roadway capacity improvements that hinder the safety of other roadway users like pedestrians and bicyclists. The Council also clarified how and when payments in lieu of mitigation may be accepted. Several significant changes were made to the pedestrian system adequacy test. This is in section TL 2.3 of the resolution. The new test incorporates a scoping scale based on the number of peak hour person trips generated by the proposed development. The more trips generated, the larger the area required to be tested. The scoping is also distinguished by policy area category. The new test requires the applicant to demonstrate a somewhat comfortable or very comfortable pedestrian level of comfort or PLOC on streets and intersections within the scaled scope of the project site. Certain roads and intersections are exempt from the analysis. A PLOC map and detailed methodology can be found on the Planning Department's website. There are two additional requirements for the pedestrian test. Another new component requires the applicant to evaluate existing street lighting within the scaled scope of the test and upgrade any lighting that does not meet the county standards. The test also maintains the previously required check for ADA compliance. However, the scoping from the previous test has been changed. As with the motor vehicle test, the new policy clearly explains how and when a payment in lieu of mitigation may be accepted. The test for bicycle system adequacy, which is found in section TL 2.4 of the policy resolution, is relatively unchanged from the previous policy. The main difference relates to the scaled scoping of the test based on the number of peak hour person trips generated by the proposed development. And again, the policy now includes language to explain how and when payments in lieu of mitigation may be accepted. But like the pedestrian test, the transit system adequacy test, which is in section TL 2.5 of the resolution, has been overhauled. The new test is focused on conditions related to bus shelters. Where shelters don't exist, the applicant may be required to construct shelters with real-time information displays within the scaled scope of the development site. As with the other tests, the new policy clearly explains how and when payment in lieu of mitigation may be accepted. And finally, as mentioned earlier, the new growth and infrastructure policy requires applicants to submit a Vision Zero statement for any development application estimated to generate 50 or more peak hour person trips. This slide explains the requirements of the statement, which are also detailed in section TL3 of the resolution. And finally, here is a list of resources, several of which I referenced earlier, which may be useful to applicants and other policy stakeholders as we move forward under the new growth and infrastructure policy. This includes links to our growth and infrastructure policy page, the interactive web map, the page that contains our annual school test guidelines, test results, and school utilization report, the text of the adopted growth and infrastructure policy resolution, and the PLOC map and methodology. I'm going to take one final minute to highlight the two maps on this list. This is the growth and infrastructure policy web map. On the right-hand side, you can select from several layers that relate to the policy, including, as you see here already, the school impact layer. You can also look at the transportation policy area category layer, the desired growth and investment areas layer, and layers related to the different levels of utilization premium payment requirements for FY21. On the top left, you can enter an address to zoom to a particular location to better understand how the policy applies to that location. Here, this is now zoomed to the new Planning Department headquarters in Wheaton at 2425 Reedy Drive. This is the PLOC map, which shows the PLOC scores for roads and intersections throughout the county. Planning staff is currently working on completing the map for every road and intersection in the county as part of our pedestrian master plan effort. A description of the PLOC and how to read the map is included on the right-hand side. Applicants can come to this map to see the PLOC scores applicable to their site, but if the map does not currently contain the needed scores, the applicant can calculate the scores using the PLOC methodology themselves. Applicants can contact planning staff for assistance with this as well. In fact, planning staff are available to answer any questions people may have about the new growth and infrastructure policy, and I encourage you to not hesitate to reach out to us. That concludes my presentation. I hope that you have found this useful. Thank you again for tuning in.